Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications. So Tim, you were away, but we really did have a wonderful Southern California gala with Kellyanne Conway. Her book is Here's a Deal. It's a New York Times bestseller. I have to say, Tim, because, we were both former speechwriters, she gave one of the best speeches at a PRI gala. Her speech was customized to the think tank world that we're here in California. She also referred to PRI's work. So no stump speech for Kellyanne. It was totally customized to us. And when I went to pick her up at a private designated room, sort of like a green room that we created for her, she was carefully reviewing her speech and making notes. True professional. I thought she was very impressive.
That's speech writing 101, right? Always know your audience.
So the legislature is deep into budget season in Sacramento. So how's that going?
Well, we do have a budget that has been passed by the legislature, but that doesn't really mean too much because they just have to pass the budget by July 15th in order to keep getting their paychecks. But interestingly, there still are big differences between the Democratic leaders in the legislature and Governor Newsom. And it's mainly around what form of tax rebate for high gas prices and inflation, what form is that going to take? Democrats in the legislature, the leadership want to give a $200 per person rebate, and it would be by income level. So I think it's if you make over $125,000, you wouldn't get anything. And then also they want to give an additional per child tax credit. Well, the governor wants to give $400 per vehicle for a total of $800. And there are big debates over, well, is one better than the other? And how would you give it? Whether it's debit cards, how would you get it out the fastest? Meanwhile, Republicans in the legislature and a growing number of Democrats in the legislature want to just suspend the gas tax for 6 months or a year. And I learned this weekend through the grapevine, I've wondered, why wouldn't you just pass that bill? We have the money to backfill any lost revenue for road construction and infrastructure, if we were to do that this year. And apparently the interests who benefit from that money, including the unions, don't want to set a precedent of ever suspending the gas tax. So that really shows you who controls Sacramento. So even though, some members of the legislature could actually lose their seats over this, we still continue with no budget gas tax relief in sight, and it doesn't seem like we're on the verge of having a relief. So going forward, what I would predict is the governor and Democrats in the legislature will reach agreement on some sort of tweaks to the main budget bill to be able to get his signature by June 30th, and then, expect them to continue to debate the gas tax and other outstanding issues through the summer. The real deadline is the end of session at the end of August. But meanwhile, Californians continue to struggle with over $6 a gallon gas. I saw in the Bay Area over the weekend, it was $6.79 a gallon, I believe I saw at one gas station. So, we will see, but I would not count on getting that gas tax relief anytime soon.
Well, Tim, it's actually $7 here in Los Angeles and many of the downtown gas stations. I can see why they would hesitate to suspend the gas tax, because once the suspension is lifted, it's going to look like a tax hike. And that's going to be awkward for everyone. Of course, conservatives, free market types like us, that it looks like a tax hike. Maybe they will actually lower it. But I can see why some of the progressives don't want to see what would look sort of like a tax hike. So in Washington, President Biden is still trying to figure out what he can do to show the American people he's doing something about inflation. This weekend, I was watching the Sunday shows, and they sent out Brian Dees, who leads their National Economic Council. And he's been towing the line, blaming Putin, blaming the pandemic, supply chain problems. The fact is, there's just too much money chasing too few goods. And that's the very definition of inflation. And when Biden, and of course Newsom, I might add, flooded the economy with free money during the pandemic, well, here we are. So last week's So last week's inflation number came in at 8.6% for the 12-month period, but month to month, it was 1%. So that was higher than the previous month. So think about it. If you annualize 1% over a year, that's 12% that we could potentially be looking at over the next year or so. So that's a very scary thing. And the cost of living is already so high here in California. And we're definitely going to have more pain ahead. So Tim, you got another great guest from the Heritage Foundation's Resource Bank Conference. So in Nashville. So how about introducing him?
Yes. So our guest this week is Randy Hicks, who's the president of the Georgia Center for Opportunity, and they are PRI's sister think tank in the state of Georgia. And Randy has a great California connection. He grew up in California. He went to USC in Biola. He worked for State Senator Marion Bergeson, who is really a mentor for Republican women interested in running for office and serving in public service. And his dad was the district attorney of Orange County for many years. So, thanks to job opportunities, he found his way to Georgia. And so you'll hear, a lot of his stories of his upbringing and his thoughts as a former Californian on what's going on here. But the Georgia Center does a lot of work on issues that PRI engages in, including poverty and homelessness and education reform and economic opportunity. And so we really have a good discussion of how free market ideas and market-based solutions can help empower people economically. And we even talk about how even in Georgia, where you think it'd be a pretty easy lift to pass some of these reforms, especially education reforms, they actually had a tough time of it this year, and you'll hear from him why. So I think our listeners will find this a very interesting episode.
Thanks so much, Tim.
Well, Randy Hicks, thank you so much for joining us here in Nashville at the Resource Bank Conference for Next Round Podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be with you. I'm looking forward to not only being at this conference, but also chatting with you about some of the things going on in Georgia, in California, and across the country.
So we're excited to have the opportunity to chat with you today about the work that the Georgia Center for Opportunity does, and we're big fans of your work here at PRI. But before we get into all the policy discussions, our listeners may not know that you're a one-time Californian and have an interesting family history, really, in California, and you're a fellow Trojan, and also graduated from Biola. So maybe you could share with our listeners, what took you from our once golden state to working on public policy issues in Georgia and other states. And for our listeners who may not be familiar with the Georgia Center, tell us about your work and your policy priorities.
Yeah, I grew up in Orange County, California. I grew up in Tustin, went to Foothill High School. I went to USC and got my undergraduate degree in political science. And then I went on to get a master's degree it's a master's of divinity or a master's of theology at the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. And while I was working on that master's degree, I was also working full-time for a California state senator in Newport Beach, Marion Bergeson. She's a fantastic lady, fantastic public servant. She later served as Secretary of Education under Governor Pete Wilson. She was an Orange County supervisor. Marion had a massive district. I mean, it took in coastal Orange County, but also wrapped its way around the east side of San Diego County, went all the way to the Mexico border and all the way to the Arizona border. So it was this massive district. I was in the most attractive part, Newport Beach, not a bad place to be. Then I was hired by a Christian ministry called Focus on the Family. My job was to help leaders in various Midwestern states launch advocacy organizations around family-related policy. And I never thought I'd leave California, never thought I'd leave Orange County, quite frankly, but Focus on the Family decided that they were going to move to Colorado Springs, which also isn't a bad place to be. And I kind of bit the bullet and made the move that I thought I'd never make, which was out of California. But it was there I met my wife. She and I later went and worked with Jeff Kemp. Many of your listeners will remember Jeff Kemp. He was a former NFL quarterback, played for the Rams, the 49ers, and the Seahawks, kind of worked his way up the coast playing quarterback for various teams. And of course, he's the son of the famous Jack Kemp, former vice presidential candidate, HUD secretary, and congressman. So that's kind of the journey that got me up to the Seattle area where I was for 3 years, and then I was recruited to come to Georgia. And that was no easy decision. We love Atlanta, love the Southeast, but I wasn't sure I wanted to start over and build an organization essentially from scratch. But ultimately, it's what my wife and I felt we should do, so we made the move. As far as the Georgia Center for Opportunity, this is how we often describe our work. Our work revolves around what is called, or what we call often, the defining American idea, that everyone should have an opportunity to achieve a better life. We can't force anybody to take that opportunity, seize the opportunity, but everyone ought to have the opportunity to achieve a better life, regardless of race, the circumstances of one's birth, or past mistakes. And so that's really what we're about, but we're particularly focused on low-income and poor Americans. We want to remove the barriers that exist for low income and poor Americans, the most vulnerable among us, so that they have an opportunity to flourish, an opportunity to achieve that better life that I mentioned. Now, so broadly speaking, our work is organized around something called the success sequence. And the success sequence is actually based on research that was done by the Brookings Institution. So this isn't part of some vast right-wing conspiracy. And what the research shows is that of all the Americans who have at least graduated from high school, found steady employment, and waited till they were married to have kids, only 2 to 3% are living in poverty today. Of those who have gotten those three things wrong, 75% are living in poverty today. Now, people will move in and out of poverty, but that's the reality of the importance of those three things. So our policy ideas are centered around removing barriers in those areas: access to quality education, access to jobs, and the ability to form and sustain a healthy, stable family life.
As we've certainly documented in our work at PRI, California unfortunately leads the nation in poverty, and really years of policy mistakes from state government are making it more difficult for people to climb that economic ladder and into prosperity. Now, I know one issue that you've been working on in Georgia, and which Damon Dunn wrote about in our PRI book, Punning Poverty, are so-called benefits cliffs that make it harder for people to get out of poverty. So what are benefit cliffs, and what can California or Georgia or other states do to reform or repeal these policies?
I want to talk about the benefits cliff in a minute. I'm going to answer that question, but I want to make, I think, a very important point about why we have a hugely persistent problem in California and elsewhere when it comes to poverty. The benefits cliff is part of it, but much of it is just related to mindset. You know, Mauricio Miller is a guy who works in Oakland. He serves a low-income Californians in Oakland, helping them rise from poverty, or helping them help themselves is a better way to put it. And one of the things he said was, as he was being raised in poverty himself, is that he found that poverty was survivable but not escapable. That's what we've done with the system. And the benefits cliff it reflects that problem. So I'm going to describe it by telling a story. It's about a lady named Shannon. On a Friday afternoon, not long ago in Metro Atlanta, Shannon was a single mom, was invited into her boss's office where he gave her a promotion and a pay raise. And she left thrilled, tears in her eyes, tears of joy, excited about what it meant for her, excited about what it meant for her kids. That was Friday afternoon. On Monday, she came back to the office and turned it all down. Why did she turn it down? It's because she was going to lose thousands more in government assistance than she was going to gain in pay. This happens all the time. We hear stories like this all the time of Americans, in our case, Georgians quite specifically, turning down jobs, turning down promotions, turning down overtime, walking off the job mid-shift to avoid some sort of government punishment where suddenly benefits drop off so drastically that they really can't work anymore. And that's the benefits cliff. And the reason why it exists is kind of interesting. We really don't have a welfare system in Georgia, in America. We never have had a system. It's really a mishmash of government programs developed over many, many decades. And each one of those programs was developed for a different reason. So historically, no one's ever had a really clear picture. We know the cliffs exist, but nobody's had a clear picture as to how those cliffs actually occur and where they come. So we created a computational model and we now have 9 states loaded into it. We're continuing to load more. That allows people to see how high the benefits stack, and then where as someone's net earnings kind of increases, the benefits suddenly drop off. Those cliffs come. And it's really the first time people have had a clear picture of how that benefits cliff works. So one of the challenges with the benefits cliffs, and one of the problems with our welfare programs, is that they're almost all federal programs. And there are some limitations. They come with strings. They come with some very specific ways of doing things. But there is some flexibility within programs. So, for instance, when it comes to something like the child care tax credit, there is some flexibility states have to create a more sane approach to child care. It's also true for housing and other things. One of the big things that can be done that I think is super important, and this may tie into other questions you may ask me later, but I think one of the key things we can do is connect work with assistance. So right now there's only one state that has brought together both workforce services and government assistance programs, and that's the state of Utah. So when someone comes in for government assistance, one of their first conversations is about work. And government assistance is talked about as workplace support. It exists to help you work, not just to help you survive. So the idea in Utah is that we're trying to make this escapable, not just survivable. And that's where we're headed in Georgia. We're working on something at the federal level to make, because right now Utah's the only one that has it and the only one that can do it. So we're looking to change that law so that states can combine workforce services with government assistance programs.
As an aside, for our readers who read Damon Dunn's Punning Poverty book, there's a great story he tells in the beginning. Damon grew up in tremendous poverty in Texas, lived with his grandparents, and his grandmother calculated the, based on a raise that they were going to get. They calculated what that very cliff. And she realized, we'd be better off if we quit our jobs and just had government assistance than to take this money. And that's what they did. And he speaks of, they didn't live a glamorous life. He has the famous stories that we were fed mayonnaise sandwiches. But just from that very young age, that always struck him, that literally even then, folks in, low education, high poverty in Texas are figuring out, calculate what you're making versus what you could get from government.
Yeah, and I would argue again, it stuck with him because he recognized there was something deeply wrong with it. And he probably looked around at the rest of the world and saw other people living a different way. And I want to emphasize this. This is a dehumanizing view of the poor, that we allow that kind of thing to happen. It wasn't long ago that I was asked to facilitate. This is another example of the mindset, I think, that gets in the way of real solutions, whether it's California, Georgia, or anywhere in the country. I was facilitating a conversation with business leaders and nonprofit leaders in one of Metro Atlanta's largest counties. This was a big meeting with a lot of leaders and heavy hitters. And we were talking about what we ought to be doing over the next 10, 20 years to address issues of poverty. And we were talking about self-sufficiency and the things people need to become self-sufficient and self-reliant. And one of the most recognizable and respected experts on social services said, essentially, they don't need any of that. They just need to be made comfortable. Well, the reality is that's not how we want to live. I mean, just think about this for a minute, Tim. Think about what it means to be a human. Think about what it means to be you. And you and your listeners know that a job is more than just a source of income. It's a source of pride, purpose, and belonging. It provides us with a sense of well-being that comes from earning success and being needed by a community, right? In this case, a workplace, and by enjoying the fruits of your labor. And yet we think we just need to make them comfortable, or as Mauricio Miller said, just to make poverty survivable? Or is there more to life? We would not accept it for ourselves. We would not accept it for our loved ones. So why do we accept it for low-income and poor Americans?
So kind of building on this that we touched on a little bit, this problem of non-work. In California, we've seen and we're not talking about the great resignation, in the wake of COVID. This is your same Governor Newsom, the former mayor of Stockton, Michael Tubbs, who's kind of built a cottage industry on this, let's throw money at people through basic income rather than removing these government-created barriers to starting a business or getting a good paying job at a startup. And we know that basic income, as they're talking about it, and they admit it's not a substitute for traditional government social programs, it's in addition to. So there's the one question of, well, how will we pay for this? But the bigger thing is, this doesn't break that cycle of poverty. It's that what you were just talking about, making comfortable life in poverty. So what have you found in your research on this problem of non-work, and what advice do you have for policymakers to reverse this troubling trend?
So last fall, we did extensive research on the effects of non-work on people. So we looked at over 40 different studies on what non-work does to people. So I want you to think about this. Forget about all the benefits, forget all about that. Just think about the effects of not working. And what the research shows conclusively is that there is a very close correlation between non-work and poor and declining mental health, non-work and shorter lifespans, non-work and bad outcomes for children, the children of non-workers. So, and by the way, there's also evidence that non-work not only reduces your engagement, obviously, out in the community from a work perspective, but just from a community engagement perspective. So there's this across the board, non-work is harmful to people. On the other hand, when people go from non-work to work, we see all those things reverse. And in fact, one of the things we see that even for those with disability or people recovering from sickness, research shows that work can be therapeutic. It promotes recovery. It minimizes the physical and mental aspects of physical illness. So work is a fundamental good, not just because it provides us with income, but because it's just good for us. We're wired for it. Like I said a minute ago, work is more than just a source of income. It's a source of pride and purpose. So what can we do? This is easier for us in Georgia, and there's a lot of talk about it. We've been meeting with lawmakers and most influential legislative committees in Georgia. I won't go over that here, and meeting with the governor. But one of the most important things we need to do is elevate work. Just elevate work. Make it important. Enforce work requirements. When COVID hit, the few programs that did require work, they suddenly weren't requiring it anymore. And at the time, it made sense because a lot of businesses were shut down. They weren't hiring anyway. Well, that's not the case anymore. And one of the reasons why people aren't returning, we believe that one of the reasons why people aren't returning to work is because it's not required of them. They don't know how to work their way back into it. But I'll go back to what I said before. Combine workforce services with government assistance programs, make them work-centric, and help people climb out of poverty.
So like PRI, education reform is a key issue that you work on at the Georgia Center. And I know that recently you've been a big proponent of efforts to create what you're calling promise scholarships. And our Lance Azumi has argued that giving every family, particularly those in low-income communities, a education, freedom of account, or whatever you might want to call it, is really the key to ensuring every student can break out of a failing status quo school and have the opportunity to attend the school of their choice. But surprisingly, you face kind of a tough road in trying to pass your legislation. So share with our listeners the details of your proposal and why you think pro-education freedom legislation would face an uphill battle in a state that an outsider like me would think you'd have a pretty easy chance to get that through.
Yeah, Tim, the battle in Georgia is similar to battles being fought all across the country. Remember, there are a lot of legislatures that are controlled by Republicans. And even so, we're having a hard time getting education savings accounts and other school choice programs through. In our case, this bill, it's an education savings account bill that creates Promise Scholarship. But essentially what it does is it takes money, state money, that would have paid for the student to get an education in a public school, sets it aside into an account that can be controlled by the parent with whitelisted approved expenses, right, for education purposes. That's what the ESA was all about. It's $6,000. That was it, which we have found, generally speaking, helps with most private school education. In some places, as you know, that wouldn't be that much. It wouldn't cover very much of it. Now, you would think that in a state like Georgia, with a Republican governor, Republican-controlled House chambers, that bill would pass. But the reality is that the real fight is at the rural area, in the rural community. Partly because there aren't that many options down there, out in rural areas. As you know, that's true everywhere across the country. It's true in California as well. And generally speaking, lawmakers don't want to go against their superintendents. In every county in Georgia, the largest employer is a school district. They have friends and family employed by them. They fear what they could do to them politically, and so they're just reticent when it comes to school choice. Now, we're not giving up. We're going to keep pushing forward. We really think that we all need to be beating the drum on the simplest of messages, which is the money follows the child. Money follows the child wherever they go, whether it's to another public school, to a private school, to a homeschool. Money follows the child so that the child can succeed. That's what school is about. That's what education funding is about. Money ought to follow the child. And again, we've made a lot of progress over the years. We organized the coalition that passed the first school choice bill in Georgia, the second school choice bill. We drafted the second one. So we've been working on this a long time, and we've made progress. There are tens of thousands of Georgians getting private school educations because of those changes. But there are still so many kids locked into poor performing schools. I actually believe it's a justice issue. We probably need to be talking about it that way as well.
So, like in Georgia, crime is an issue of growing concern, really for all Americans, but certainly for most Californians, and one we've done a lot of work on at PRI. And there's really a national debate, especially among, conservatives and libertarians and people on our side of the spectrum about criminal justice reform. And we've had the opportunity on this podcast and at PRI's event to talk with leaders like Pat Nolan and Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert about this issue. In California, we've seen a major public policy shift over the past decade and kind of now paying the price for it with rampant shoplifting and growing incidents of violent crime. Now, I know criminal justice reform is a big issue in your work at the Georgia Center. So what are your thoughts from across the country on what's going wrong in California on crime issues? And what are some of the reform ideas that you're working on in Georgia that you believe might inspire responsible change in California and other states?
So I'm going to start with what we've done from a public policy perspective and other things we're doing. A number of years ago, we decided to really dig deeply into this issue because we had an exceptionally high percentage of Georgians under state supervision, right? Probation, parole, or prison, right? And in fact, it was 1 out of 13 adults in Georgia were under state supervision. That's a huge number. And that just represents the adults. They also have kids, many of them, right? So it's this massive number affected by criminal justice system. So what we first focused on was prisoner reentry. What are the reforms? The number one predictor of whether or not someone will go back to prison is whether or not they get a job. We're back to work. We've been talking about work. We're going back to work again because it is the number one predictor of whether or not somebody who has left prison will re-enter prison, connect with their community and family in any healthy way. And yet, in most states, we have lots of barriers that keep people from re-entering that workforce. So one of the things we've done, and we've done a number of things, we've made sure that they had driver's licenses as long as their crimes didn't involve the use of a car. We made occupational licenses more accessible. There were many who were just disqualified because they had gone to prison. Well, that makes no sense. There are many great jobs they could develop the skills to do, and yet they were shut off from them. Right now, we're working on more occupational licensing reforms so that people will have more access to those jobs. And also we're working on civil asset forfeiture. That is abused by law enforcement, so I'm a pro-law enforcement guy. Tim, you know this. My dad was the district attorney of Orange County, California for 23 years. I'm a law enforcement guy. My mom was a deputy LA sheriff. My father-in-law was a California highway patrolman. I am pro-law enforcement, but civil asset forfeiture laws need to be changed. Because oftentimes you're taking the biggest asset somebody has for what oftentimes is a minor crime. Now, what's happened in California from my perspective, and I don't know all the details, is you've all just gone crazy. Again, this is a low view of humanity where you think that you can't raise the bar, raise expectations, and enforce the law. Sometimes you enforce the law in order to be in a position to have leverage to encourage someone to do better, right? So in Georgia, another thing that's really grown is accountability courts. For instance, drug courts. So what we don't want to do in Georgia is just put anybody who's been arrested back on the street and treat it like it's no big deal. What we want to do instead is use that opportunity, use that leverage to make them accountable for next steps to get on course, right? So they typically work with a judge who says, here's your plan. This is what you need to work to get on your feet and get headed in the right direction. So those are the kinds of things we should be doing. California has decided for some reason that there's just a lot of criminal activity that isn't criminal anymore. And I mean, it's truly absurd. And California's paying a high price. You have businesses leaving cities that don't want to work there anymore. You have Californians leaving those same cities because they're tired of what they're seeing. You just have this. It's a strange thing to watch. After having grown up in a law enforcement family in California, it's a strange thing to watch from across the country as district attorneys in places like the Bay Area and LA, basically decriminalize crime.
Yet they always say, well, crime rates have gone down. Well, if there are fewer things criminalized, maybe we don't need an academic to do that study. Maybe that's why crime rates have gone down. So kind of on that really kind of amalgamation of all these problems really are having a terrible effect on our great big cities. California, who doesn't want to go to see San Francisco or be in LA? These are America's great cities. So we've launched a project that we're calling the Free Cities Project, really to bring together kind of leading conservative thinkers to offer market reforms and ideas to solve all these issues that are, affecting urban communities and improve the quality of life for those who live there. And I think the work you've done at the Georgia Center really is providing a national model for free market ideas on these major urban problems, but you don't often hear conservative voices speaking up on these issues like poverty and homelessness that we talked about today. So why do you think it's so important for conservatives and free market advocates to engage in this area?
Ultimately, free markets are about people, right? Free markets matter not because they're perfect, but because they provide people with the richest set of opportunities to achieve that better life I talked about earlier, to achieve their potential. And so one of the things so it's important for that reason, right? It's just flat out important that we as conservatives recognize that the reason we're supporting free markets is not simply because we have a preference for them. It's that we believe they're connected to human well-being. So let's speak up about that. Let's talk about its benefits to people, and not just from an economic perspective, but from those things we were talking about, work and non-work, right? So we should be happy warriors when it comes to talking about free markets giving people that richest set of opportunities. The other thing, though, I would say is, and I think this is super important, and we've taken steps that I'm going to describe in a minute to engage in this way. One of the things we often say at the state level from a public policy perspective is, hey, lawmakers, don't wait for the federal government to act. Do what you can do in the state of California or the state of Georgia to have an impact, to bring about the change that you can. Well, I also want to say to local community leaders, business leaders, nonprofit leaders, faith community leaders, don't wait for the state to do anything. Take action in your community. One of the things we've done is we've launched in 2 large kind of metro areas, Gwinnett County, our second largest county in Georgia. It's in metro Atlanta, and Columbus, Georgia. We've launched Better Work initiatives. And essentially what we're doing there is we're coordinating the efforts of businesses and nonprofits and the faith community to identify and equip the chronically un- and underemployed to find work. So these are business leaders that have a vision for the good they bring, not just the need they have. Like, I have a need for an employee, but I bring good when I hire someone. I give someone the opportunity to develop a skill set, to get on to get on a positive income progression. And so we have almost 50 businesses that have committed to giving anybody who enters this Better Work initiative an interview at the very least, which is a big issue for people who are poor. But my whole point in talking about that is that I think it's imperative that we not always even look to Sacramento or look to Atlanta or look to Washington, but we say, what can we be doing in our own communities to create opportunity? Let's not wait for the state government to work. Let's put free markets on display rather than waiting for the government to change its tune. And by the way, in California, it may take a while to change the tune. But I'll tell you what's going to do it is when communities actually become competitive in proving the importance of civil society. And I want to emphasize civil society probably even more than free markets. I consider free markets to be kind of a subset of civil society, right? But it's communities taking action. It's in communities where lives are formed, and when things go badly, it's where lives are transformed. And so we've really got to model that and become champions for.
So PRI, kind of on that point, PRI has launched what we're calling, it's the Been There, Done That campaign, and we're really trying to warn people in the rest of the country about bad legislation enacted over the years in California that we've had a front row seat to, unfortunately, that is inspiring policymakers in the Biden administration and Congress and other state capitals around the country to make these same bad choices. So looking at some of the policy fights that you're engaging on in Georgia, what are some of the bad ideas from California that you're seeing making their way to, well, hopefully not becoming law in the beach state?
Yeah, well, we were talking about one of them, decriminalization of crime. That's one thing that we're going to avoid. The way you've approached bail reform, the constant talk about defunding the police, we've pretty much gotten past that now. On the defunding the police part, I mean, there's a serious mayoral candidate in LA who yesterday announced that she has a plan to basically do away with LAPD. That's insanity. So those are some things that are easy to reject. We also certainly are going to reject a lot of the regulatory environment in California, which is so heavy-handed. It's the reason why businesses are constantly leaving California, and many are coming to Georgia and Texas and other places. Georgia has been ranked the best place to do business, the best state to do business multiple years running now. So we're just ignoring a lot of what California does on these items.
That's the way to go about it when these things come about. So, as we close, the work and research of the Georgia Center shows how, as we were saying, market-based reforms can positively turn people's lives around and create safer, more livable communities. Looking at California from afar and our ongoing problems that we've discussed with crime and homelessness and, add housing, of course, to the mix, that seem to grow worse by the day. What's your message to policymakers in Sacramento? What can we learn from Georgia and your work that would make a difference in righting some of the once Golden State's big challenges?
So the first thing I'd say to policymakers is to remember that your job is not to solve every problem. Your job is to create the conditions in which problems are more likely to be solved, to create the conditions in which people can flourish. So, for instance, your job is not to run a business. It's your job to create an environment where businesses can flourish. And the reason you want that business to flourish is because hopefully, those businesses will create an environment where individuals flourish. That's how all these things are tied together. So understand what your role is. Your role is not to solve every problem. There's some you have to, but when it comes to some of these more persistent problems, the way to approach it is, what are the barriers that are keeping people at the local level, individuals and even organizations and even businesses, from solving many of these problems themselves? What can we do from a policy perspective to again create those healthy conditions? And we talk a lot about habitat. There's no state in the country that talks more about habitats and the reason we need to protect them, because there are certain habitats in which this little fish, will survive better than others. Well, the same is true of people, and the same is true of communities. There are conditions in which people are more likely to flourish. So think about those and do a little bit more of getting out of the way than meddling.
So finally, Randy, my favorite question on every one of these podcasts. So PRI calls our podcast Next Round because of our proximity to wine country and our love of discussing public policy while enjoying a glass of wine. So the next time we come to visit you in Georgia, what wine or beer or cocktail or other beverage do you recommend our visitors from California give a try when they're there?
Yeah, so I'm a craft brewery guy for all sorts of reasons. One is I think it's one of the absolute best examples of free enterprise at work. It's one of the most creative and innovative industries out there, and I just love the industry. So I'm gonna mention a few brewers. Monday Night Brewing, our friends at Monday Night Brewing, fantastic people, and they make a fantastic beer. Their Drafty Kilt Scotch Ale, fantastic, great beer. Also Orpheus, great local brewer, and then Scofflaw. Scofflaw, that's the name of the brewer, which is kind of funny. We've been talking about law enforcement and crime. But Scofflaw, they make a great basement IPA. So anyway, just I would recommend that. And just from a kind of a uniquely Georgia perspective, peach cider. And if you want to spice it up a little, add some vodka or something. But it's very good.
Well, you're giving us great ideas for when we come to visit you in Georgia. Randy Hicks, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim. It's a real privilege to have been on this show with you. And best wishes to all of you at PRI. You guys are doing important work.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.